Good afternoon, I'm George Papagiannis, and welcoming you to another of UNESCO's Facebook Lives, live from our Paris headquarters, where today I'm joined by Julie Passetti. Julie is a senior research fellow at Oxford University's Reuters Institute, and also the co-author with Sherilyn Ireton of a new UNESCO publication. This, I tell you, is timely. Journalism, fake news, and disinformation. Now, I just have to make one point here, is that the fake news is
crossed out.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's crossed out. We should say bleep news when we say fake news.
So we've got our bleep news, and you're going to tell us why, Julie. And let me just say it's a pleasure to have you with us. I know that you've actually done some other publications for UNESCO. You've been very much involved in the work that we're doing here in support of freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and certainly appreciate what you're bringing to the table. But in particular, the timeliness of something like this, it's at the top of everybody's stream of consciousness, I guess you might call it, which seems to be what you hear is a lot of stream of consciousness and perhaps not much there.
Substance.
So what's about this fake news? What are we talking about here in this publication? Journalism, fake news, and
bleep
news, and disinformation.
There's a reason that we have crossed it out. I mean, we're making light of it, and we do tend to make light of it because it's so hard to avoid the term fake news when describing the crisis that is disinformation, or information disorder, as we refer to it. So we've actually crossed it out on the title, and we're quite cautious about the way we use the term for two reasons, really. If it's news, it's not fake, right? It's an oxymoron. So news is about verifiable information shared in the public interest, and if it's fake, it's therefore not news. The other important factor is that the term fake news, although it began really as a way of describing satirical journalism, comedy that purported to be news, that used comedic narratives to send up issues of the day, it has since been absolutely weaponized and deployed against credible journalism, against credible journalists, as a way of trying to erode trust in the news, in professional journalism, as a way of trying to avoid accountability on the part of the political leaders and other corporate actors who do that. So we have a situation where a term that was originally used to describe satirical news has been used as a weapon against professional journalism and credible information, as a way of distracting from critical content that's critical, say, of political leaders or governments.
But isn't it just propaganda then?
So propaganda is more overt. You know, if you see propaganda, you tend to recognise it as an obvious message peddled by, say, a government or a corporate actor to try and convince you to do something or other. So in the context of the 100th year of the armistice, you might cast your mind back to World War I propaganda posters, which were about encouraging sign-up and conscription, for example. Disinformation, which is one of the key forms of information disorder that we want to start getting people to think about. Disinformation is deliberate falsehood. It's the fabrication of information done in such a way that it's not immediately recognisable to you or to me necessarily. Plenty of journalists have been fooled by it, but certainly the general public. It's designed as a way of hiding the intent, but creating a pollution, if you like, in our information ecosystem.
If you're interested in being part of this conversation, we actually invite you to do so. Occasionally, you might see me looking down at my phone because I'm also following what people are posting as commentary on our Facebook account. And if you have a question, I'm happy to put it to Julie if it's relevant. But I'm sure all of you are thinking really, for that real kind of zinger question that will get us onto more deeply into this subject matter. So please, be part of the conversation. Also, hashtag Fight Fake News, and also the hashtag IGF 2018. If you're going on Twitter, on Facebook, don't forget to use the hashtags. And you know where we are, our Twitter handle at UNESCO. Please, let's engage on this subject because it's all about the truth, is it not?
It is. It's about truth and trust. And I think we use humour in a way to disguise our frustration with current debates around disinformation. And let's take a moment actually to sort of unpack that a bit. So we
Yeah.
don't want to use the term fake news. We want to use more nuanced and deliberate terms that actually describe what it is that we're talking about. So disinformation is one. I've just shared a little bit about that. Misinformation is another kind of inaccurate information, and that really goes to information that might be shared without malicious intent. It's like inadvertently sharing something that's wrong, for example, or publishing something that's wrong, rather than deliberately fabricated information. And there's another category that's been identified by researchers at Harvard and First Draft News, including Claire Wardle, called malinformation. Now, this is a really interesting new category of information pollution, if you like, and that goes to information that may have elements of truth mixed with disinformation, but it's shared deliberately and specifically with a view to mislead, and it's malicious in its intent. So it's malicious perhaps in terms of the kind of outcome, whether it's disrupting or effectively hacking an election, whether it is harassing a journalist, a female journalist in particular, as is often the case in these campaigns, with falsely created or pictures of, say, the female journalist, or video of the female journalist purporting to show her as a prostitute, which we've seen with journalists in the Philippines and India and South Africa, for example. So it's malicious intent along with disinformation. Content that's designed to create confusion around information.
Is there a strong gender component to this? As you mentioned, malinformation with showing a female journalist as a prostitute. I mean,
Yeah.
Are we seeing the same on the side of a male journalist being shown as streetwalkers? I mean, what's the
Yeah.
Are there some heightened level of attacks through malinformation that's targeting women in particular, women journalists?
We are seeing a trend. We're seeing a trend that demonstrates that at the intersection of disinformation and online harassment and journalism, we're seeing the manipulation of disinformation and, say, social networks as a way of targeting journalists, in particular female journalists, because of their increased likelihood of being victims of online harassment. So I can share a case with you from India. Rana Ayub, who's an independent investigative journalist, she was the target of a campaign that saw her receive death threats and threats to rape her, threats to harm her family, which included a fake pornographic video. Mm-hmm. That technology, and this is part of the situation we're dealing with here, technology is both empowering and disempowering. Technology has been used to, increase our access to information and our right to express ourselves freely, but at the same time, it's been turned against us. And we can see in the case of Rana Ayub, very sophisticated technology that's increasingly easy to use to create a porn video or a faux porn video that showed her purporting to be a porn actress. And that was then used to both discredit her and her journalism and to turn a mob onto her effectively.
Right, sure, of course.
And the real risk is that that can cross over into the physical realm, not just stay online.
Right, of course. And what's interesting, though, I think about what you're saying is of course, is that there's a manipulation of the information, if not just complete untruths. But we're seeing something, of course, different now than we saw in the past. I mean, yellow journalism is nothing new. I mean, there were times if I was to look at turn of the century, of the last century, yellow journalism in the United States, even the Pulitzer and the Hearst public, newspapers going at each other. But then you mentioned, of course, what technology adds to this, which is really the energizer, the turbocharger, in a way, of what's happening with this push of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things to consider here. One is the way in which journalism has been utterly disrupted, in some ways for good, in some ways very negatively, by the digital revolution. So we've seen the business models collapse, which has resulted in many newsrooms being de-staffed, lots of mass sackings, reduced capability and capacity to do great journalism in many newsrooms. Independent journalism is the mission, but when you don't have the resources and you don't have as many sub-editors and fact-checkers as perhaps you used to have, you've effectively reduced capacity to do the kind of journalism that serves open society. So it's not to say it's not being done, it's gotten harder to do because of the complications of resources. At the same time, we have seen through social media, which has given us great and highly effective access to our audiences in an unprecedented way, so that we can have these real-time conversations with people asking us questions as we discuss really complex issues. But it's enabled all of us to be publishers. Again, some good things can come out of that. So people who may not have had a platform to share expertise have now got platforms at their fingertips. But the speed with which information can be shared and the way in which it's shared peer-to-peer, where many of the people in that information chain do not have necessarily the skills to verify information. They don't necessarily have the critical assessment skills required to even identify that something looks slightly off about an image or a video. And these are skills that at a technical level many journalists are still learning when it comes to social and video.
My friend Jack sent that to me. I know Jack, he's a good guy.
Yeah, and we've all had those email chains, that is kind of like the contemporary version of the chain letter, full of disinformation. My father regularly pings me with those. Hi, Dad. So we, Dad's
getting outed.
Thankfully, Dad rarely visits Facebook. But we need to, I think, be aware, not just as journalists and editors and teachers of journalism and students of journalism, but as citizens, that we have a responsibility individually as members of this new information order to be ensuring that what we share is accurate, is credible. If it's not, if it's satire, then don't share it, without realising that it's satire. It was a joke. Make sure that you indicate it and you flag it. If something, looks too bizarre to be true, chances are it is, although these days it's difficult to make that judgment.
It's interesting what you said, though, is that we all have this responsibility. You talked about the disruption in the news industry that has, truly changed the environment in which news is presented, essentially, gathered, presented. The ombudsman has always been a critical part of a newsroom. The best of them have a good ombudsman. Is that somebody who has maybe to have a small army behind them in order to get out there more in front? Because you're talking about how we educate people. Now, I was a journalist. You were a journalist. You're too busy covering the news to make sure that the people who are either listening, reading, watching are doing so in a way in which they are media literate.
Yeah.
But who is it then within the news industry that's supposed to be taking the lead?
I think this is a really important point, and it's one of the things we've tried to do with this book. So we've actually brought together here some of the world's leading experts in fact-checking, in verification of social and video and audio content, people who have been thinking about and working in this space for many years now. And one of the reasons we've done this is because it's really important to tackle this problem collaboratively. So that means, states working with corporations, working with civil society, working with journalists. But within journalism, I think we need to recognise that part of our responsibility is to tell the stories of this disinformation era, and that necessarily involves thinking in new and creative ways about engaging members of the public in these discussions and raising awareness. Because if disinformation affects you to the extent that it leads to inaccurate details about medication, for example, if disinformation on climate change leads to you not caring about whether you take action and the ultimate results are potentially catastrophic, then you you have an independent individual responsibility to be involved in that as a citizen. But creative responses from journalists can include something that the BBC just launched this week, which is telling stories about disinformation and engaging their audiences in trying to identify where disinformation exists and to collaboratively kind of work on this problem, which is a really innovative approach to the issues. We've seen in India, for example, a publication called The Quint, trying to tackle an emerging and really troubling manifestation of disinformation, which is happening in closed groups. So we're seeing disinformation move from the very public platforms of, say, open Facebook into the more closed networks like WhatsApp.
Yeah, right.
And in India, there have been people murdered as a result of disinformation spreading.
But, how do I get the ordinary citizen? One, I mean, we're going into another direction too when we talk about these closed networks. But just in a sense of raising awareness, the ordinary citizen who's happy to be in an echo chamber that is like comfort food. It's like eating mashed potatoes all day long. And you think you're never going to get fat. And so, how do I get that person to understand that there is a larger ecosystem of news and information and break them through that when they're just,
It comes down to something like this. If you're in a bushfire, as we have in Australia, or a raging forest fire, as you have in the US, or you're in flood, do you want to be able to receive information about how to escape that is accurate and reliable? Or do you want to receive information that misleads you, that sends you down a wrong path, potentially to danger or even death? And that's an extreme example, but misinformation or disinformation in those contexts, or in the context of conflict or some other kind of attack, are potentially devastating for you as an individual. But it's not just those extreme examples, it's also the everyday examples about whether, dare I say this, which this is going to light up the internet, but should I vaccinate my child against a disease? Does vaccinating my child against said disease cause autism? I mean, these are debates that, like climate change, need to be had with reference to factual information. And we're now entering an era where it's not only those extremes that I mentioned of bushfires, but where your ability to ensure that that a government is elected in the context of accountability journalism and a stable, open society where you get to have your freedoms. If that can be disrupted through deliberate disinformation and manipulation, where does that leave you as a citizen? I know we live in an age where there's an information flood. We have to figure out how to identify the information that we can trust and rely upon. Journalism's job is to ensure that that in an inclusive, informed way, you're reporting on issues with a variety of perspectives, but with verification at its core, ensuring that what's being shared is accurate and fair and in the public interest. And the rest of us have a responsibility to contribute to that, whether it's through our knowledge, our expertise, or in debunking falsehoods as we see them come through.
I'm George Papagiannis, and I'm with Julie Pozzetti. Julie is a Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University's Reuters Institute, co-author with Sherilyn Ireton of Journalism.
Fake news.
I thought you were going to do the bleep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do the bleep. Bleep news. Disinformation. We're actually generating some interest here, so I think we're going to continue this conversation a bit, because I want to also bring some of our Facebook followers into the conversation who have been good enough to post some actually very good questions.
Good, let's hear them.
So let's hear from Mark. Mark is asking, don't you think fake news is nothing more than opinion-based information used to advance beliefs? I think he goes a little bit farther down to see more, but I'm not being able to bring that down. But that's enough for us to get started. What do you think about that comment?
So I think you can have opinionated journalism, and you can certainly have editorials, in newspapers, to give you a traditional example, that present a perspective on something. My take on that is that even editorializing, as we call it, or opinion journalism, should be based on fact. So it's opinion that's informed and based on fact. So no, I don't equate the term fake news with opinionated journalism, but I think that gets to something that at the Reuters Institute, where I'm based at the Uni of Oxford, their digital news report identified among audiences, unfortunately, a misapprehension that poor quality journalism, which could include a sense of, highly opinionated, not factually grounded content, was more likely to trigger recognition of the term fake news than, in fact, falsehoods, deliberately, fabricated information might. So I think that does indicate that we have some way to go to bring people along with us in this conversation, and it's a signal too that journalism needs to, as a profession, and there are many journalisms, but we need to collaborate, and we need to get back to core values and ethical principles.
Holly has a question which I think also gets us into the part of this conversation, which is about what fake news is doing in terms of the reputational attack that it has on established news media. And Holly says she has 2 points here. One, on the slow dissolution of investigative journalism and the public's lack of faith in the information sector. I think, again, I'm not being able to bring up the full question, but I think I know where she's going on that.
Yeah, and I think that gets to that disruption that I was talking about. We are in a period of really unprecedented and perpetual change in the way we create news and the way we distribute news. And while we have seen and continue to see some extraordinary investigative reporting, and technology has enabled that to an extent. So the Panama Papers, collaborative investigation, for example, and plenty of news organisations around the world, including those like Rappler in the Philippines, which has been targeted in orchestrated disinformation campaigns, using contemporary tools to do great investigative journalism. So that, I think, is fundamental. We have to be able to demonstrate the role of quality journalism in holding powerful people and agencies, corporations, governments to account. But we also are in a situation where we need to recognise that the way people engage with those stories may have changed. We have to think about new and interesting ways to share these sorts of important, meaningful acts of journalism with audiences. So that might mean different ways of telling stories. Maybe it's, a multi-series podcast. Maybe it's, through a series of smart memes.
You mentioned the podcast, multi-series podcast. It just makes me want to ask a question about our attention spans.
Yes.
There is one train of thought which says that it's got to be quick, like a tweet, and yet people are listening more and more to podcasts, which are anything but short.
Yeah.
What's the story on our attention spans, and are we ready to commit if it's a good well-told story with a narrative?
Yeah, I think that's one of the lessons of podcasting, and I've got some expertise and production experience on that side. But I would summarise the current trends of information consumption like this, that it is about the short and the sharp and the fast and the instantaneous and the portable and the mobile and the social, but it's also about the deep and the engaged and the meaningful and the sort of narratives that make us pull up in our car and stop to listen, or stop on a street corner to listen, because we are moved, and that might mean that we are moved to act. So it's although we see information being manipulated by playing on people's emotions in the context of disinformation, emotional response that triggers a sort of humanity in people is also a really powerful tool for storytelling about issues that are factually grounded. And we're getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of storytelling here, but I think that's one way people can relate to this. We all understand story is powerful, whether it's what we share with the people sitting around our dinner table in terms of, what we've done today, or our colleagues at work, or it's pulling together, a story that exposes corruption in a government. These stories remain essential to the way we see the world, the way we understand what's happening around us. And I think we have to be prepared to support professional storytelling in the sense of journalism that serves open societies.
One of the things that I didn't mention, although I did give the hashtag for the Internet Governance Forum, IGF 2018, is that the Internet Governance Forum is taking place here at UNESCO. We're in day 2 of the forum, one more day to go. And obviously, a lot of what we see happening, and in fact, we had here just yesterday President Emmanuel Macron of France, who spoke for quite some length about these issues in particular, and positing some ideas about how to deal with them. Not to comment on the president's speech, because we don't have enough time for that, but just to say that there's a public debate that's being engaged in, which is, I think, one in which we see an interest toward regulation, on one side, bracketing what's happening in terms of how news and information are flowing on the internet. This is all about internet governance. And what will be, I think, on the other side, those who do not want to see regulation. Is there room for regulation? Should we embrace that idea?
I think we have to be extremely cautious when we talk about regulating content. If we talk about regulating content and regulating content in the context of democratic government's insistence on regulating content, we have to be mindful that a democratic government that might have principles of freedom of expression and access to information in the public interest may not remain a democratic government, may turn into an illiberal government. And the consequences of the misuse of regulation to silence critics, to shut down news organisations, to shut down the internet so people don't get access to information, on the justification that disinformation needs to be combated, or online harassment, serious as that is as well, needs to be managed, then we enter extremely risky territory. So my response is one of great caution, and it's one that says this does need to be collaborative, as we heard yesterday, but it needs to be collaborative in the context of involving human rights organisations and journalists and journalism organisations, so that there is built into this collaborative approach an understanding of the potential impacts of regulation on our ability to access verifiable information that's been shared to support societies.
What about the other side of this too? If we, because you mentioned, I mean, you have open and liberal environments, political environments, and you already have some that are restrictive political environments. If the liberal political environments begin to restrict, what is what's the goal and objective then? Haven't we reduced our target?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to single out by name individual leaders, but we have a situation where certain Western governments and political leaders have deployed this term fake news against journalists and journalism, and we've seen other states increasingly deploy that term in response, because there's like a justification of the denigration of journalism. When you see a Western liberal government doing this, why not export that idea to justify crackdowns that have more dire consequences, including, for example, the murder of journalists with impunity.
All right, one more question from our audience on Facebook. Zoe makes a point about education starts at home, in the classroom. Our kids can be overwhelmed, and yet they're not being taught to have a keen eye on this, and that's actually, media and information literacy. Do we need to invest more in this, as we know that this environment in which information is now flowing is not about the nickel newspaper on the corner? It's in our pockets. It's everywhere. Soon we'll probably be walking with a chip in which we can check the news and have it run on the inside of our eyelids, for all we know.
Probably.
So, with
the privacy implications that involves,
and the danger of being on the street, no less.
Exactly. Look, I agree that it's a whole of society issue, and that does involve an emphasis on media and information literacy. So I taught journalism for 10 years in between being a practicing journalist and going back into industry and coming back now to the study of journalism at Oxford. And in that 10 years, I watched the internet change the ways in which my students were accessing information. And I have a 9-year-old child. The 9-year-old is really good at verification. She goes on YouTube and she can identify herself which videos about Harry Potter are likely to be fake and which ones are not. And that, so I can see emerging now, because there's increased sensitivity to this in certain contexts. Younger kids are grappling with this in effective ways. It's the generations caught in between who have not necessarily got the professional skill set, whether it's through, academic study of law or science or journalism or whatever the profession might be, that's given you this discipline of approaching information in a critical way, who have been swept up by the internet, and who are not used to applying those sorts of disciplines. It's that great group of people in the middle who have been left out of the upskilling that's required, and that's where this book really comes in. And I'd encourage you, if you're a citizen who has high school age kids, or even university age kids, and they're not studying journalism, to have a look at this, because there's some great practical exercises to take them through, and you can think about ways in which you can make those lessons appropriate for the age group, including a chapter on media and information literacy.
Julie Passetti, we have to do this again.
Okay.
All right. There's a lot more to talk about. I mean, we didn't even get into actually something I would love to talk to you about, which is what is happening in terms of how we do news, collect news, protection of sources. I know that's something that you're very much interested in. So I think we should say there's more to come.
Sure,
okay?
we can do a part 3, part 4.
Part 3, 4. Stay tuned. For all of our friends out on Facebook, Julie Passetti has been with us. The name of the book is...
I'm going to help you.
A UNESCO publication.
It is. Multi-authored.
Yeah, what is that?
It's multi-authored.
Multi-authored, that's right, with Sherilyn Ireton. And journalism, it is fake news, but it's a bleep news.
Bleep news, and it's free to download. Free.
And disinformation. And guess what? Just in time for Christmas, something for free.
Wrap it up.
And we'll even put a bow on it. We want you to be happy when you download. So by all means, and you can, I think I've got it in my notes up somewhere around here. Yes, you can download the copy for free. Just Google UNESCO.
And fight fake news.
Fake news.
Say it together, George. Fight fake news.
On 3. 1, 2, 3.
Fight fake news.
Thank you all for being with us. Julie, thank you very much.
We're
going to do this again, talk a little bit more about these issues, because I think it's something that I know that our community on Facebook is also very interested in, and by the engagement that we had. Many thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hashtag Fight Fake News at UNESCO. Be part of the conversation. I'm George Papagiannis with Julie Passetti, wishing you a great day wherever you are.
Thanks.